Thank you for joining us today for Nonprofits and Elections 2024, Why and How You Should Engage and Stay Nonpartisan. I am Tiffany Goyrley-Carter, Policy Counsel at the National Council of Nonprofits, and will be moderating today's event. First, some quick housekeeping. The webinar is recorded and all participants except speakers are on mute. Please use the Q&A to submit questions. We'll take them at the end of the webinar. Another disclaimer, some of today's presenters are attorneys. We are not your attorneys. We are not providing legal advice, and we advise that you consult a professional, your attorney, an accountant, or tax advisor for the latest and most applicable information for your specific situation. The recording will be available via YouTube after this, as will a copy of the slides. And we will be providing you with links to official IRS guidance, as well as additional trusted resources of different organizations that do this work inside and out. So thank you again for joining us. We have a great agenda for today. We'll be covering an elections overview. We have nonprofit nonpartisanship as a core value, nonprofits as trusted conveners, and permitted nonpartisan get out the vote activities. And we have an incredible lineup of experts that will be covering each of these throughout the next hour and 15 minutes. So first up, we have an elections overview for 2024, and we are excited to introduce Ben Williams. He is an Associate Director of Elections and Redistricting at the National Conference of State Legislatures. He covers redistricting, alternative voting systems, and partisan composition of legislatures. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. He was previously a public policy researcher at Princeton and has a law degree from William & Mary. Thank you, Ben, for setting the scene for us on the 2024 elections across the country.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thanks everyone for having me here. I've got 11 minutes to cover an entire election, which is ambitious to say the least. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. So I think the starting point for any conversation about what is going to happen in this November is what happened in 2023. So a couple highlights. Democrats flipped the Virginia House of Delegates. That was the third election in a row that the House of Delegates had flipped in 2019 to Democrats, 2021 to Republicans, 2023 back to Democrats again. It's a chamber that changes hands quite a bit. Republicans flipped the Louisiana governorship as well. That was a seat that had been held for 8 years by Governor John Bel Edwards, a Democrat. That was obviously a tough hold for Democrats, and indeed they were not able to hold it. It flipped back to Republicans, giving that state unified Republican control of government. I think a trend, if you ask me to think about that, is that abortion continues to be a major issue post-Dobbs. The salience of that case 18 months later in November of 2023 was very high, and we've seen this in ballot measures across the country, and I think that that will continue. On the flip side, Democrats continue overperforming in off-cycle elections so long as the area is not deep red, and that could have some relevance to the conversation about 2024, which is not an off-cycle election. Next slide, please. So what's coming up this November? It's a big election for state legislatures, but it's not the biggest. We have 5,793 seats up. That's fewer than in 2022, where we had a little over 6,000. But it's still a pretty significant election. That's nearly 3 in 4 legislators. A little over 3 in 4 legislators who are going to be elected this fall. Issue overload is the name of the day. We've got inflation, we have the war in the Middle East, we have the war in Ukraine, we have abortion. You name it, there's an issue that's salient to some subsect of voters that will be particularly relevant come this fall. And also, I will keep in mind that at this time in 2020, COVID was something that was happening overseas, and it was not an issue in the United States yet. 6 weeks later, we were in lockdowns. So that's just a point of saying that we don't know exactly what's going to happen over the next 8 months, and you should stay tuned. Last is it's looking like we're going to have a Biden-Trump rematch. That would be the first in over 50 years. It's been 1956 was the last time that we've had a rematch between two candidates for president. So voters seem less than thrilled about the possibility of that, but it looks like it is going to happen inevitably. Next slide, please. But first, I think it's helpful just a little bit of history on how we got here. Next slide. So this is a chart of legislative seats held by party. And the only thing I really want you to note is that there were a lot of volatility in the first third of the 20th century. Then with the New Deal, Democrats and the Great Depression took a significant edge in the 30s and 40s. Right after World War II, there was a brief Republican resurgence, but then it was 50 years of Democratic dominance in legislatures nationwide. And that did not end until 2010. And that last point that you see the red line cross the blue line is the Tea Party wave of 2010. And ever since then, we've been in an environment where Republicans, not Democrats, make up the majority of state legislators nationwide. Next slide. Similar chart, a little bit different thing. This is just partisan control of legislatures. You can see that there's, again, a lot of volatility here. Same sort of trends, macro, are reflected. But the thing to look at here is actually the green line, the split line. And if you look at the very bottom, look how low we are right now on that bottom right-hand corner. We're at one split legislature nationwide. So only one legislature has one chamber controlled by Democrats and one chamber controlled by Republicans. We tied that in 2018 and 2020, but in general, that's the lowest it's been since 1914. So we are at our lowest point for split control nationwide. Odds are you live in an entirely red state or entirely blue state for legislatures. Again, this is government. So now we're factoring in governors. And you can see once you factor in governors, splits are much more common, but still, we're at a point where you are more likely to live in a state with a Republican legislature and governor or a Democratic legislature and governor than you are to live in a state with some split between the two. Next slide. So this is the current partisan composition of state legislatures. Republicans have the majority nationwide, 28 states. Democrats have 20 in DC. And lonely Pennsylvania is sitting out there as the only state that is split right now. There are some that are close. Arizona is pretty close. New Hampshire is pretty close. So there are close states, among others, Virginia too, nationwide, that are closely divided between the parties. But only Pennsylvania has a legislature where one chamber, the House, is controlled by Democrats, and the other, the Senate, is controlled by Republicans. Next slide. Factoring in governors, you can see that it's much closer, 27 to 23. Again, Republicans have a slight edge. That's largely because Democrats have won on some unfriendly turf in Kansas, Kentucky, and North Carolina. And Republicans have won on unfriendly turf in Vermont. So governors tend to not reflect the national party to a certain extent, but I bet if you looked at this map, you would think those are mostly red states or mostly blue states. It's mirroring what you would see in the elections for president by and large. Next slide. Factor in those two charts we just saw, or those two maps, put them all together. This is what you get. This is the map of control. You can see that there are only 9 states that have divided control, and there are 40 that have unified control. So 80% of states have unified control of government. Nebraska has a nonpartisan legislature, nominally Republican with a Republican governor, but it is officially nonpartisan. So NCSL classifies it as nonpartisan. Next slide. So state races next year, sort of the meat of what you care about. There are going to be legislative races in 33 states in the District of Columbia. 11 states are going to have legislative and gubernatorial races. And keep in mind, just because there are legislative races doesn't mean all the seats are up. It could just be one chamber or the other, or a lot of states that have senates that are elected on 4-year terms that are staggered. So you'll have half the Senate or a third of the Senate up at any given time. But just know, any state is in color here. It's a state that is going to have a race. The states in gray will not have a legislative or gubernatorial race. Next slide. So competitive chambers to watch. This is a pretty broad list, I have to say. I think the important thing to remember here is we don't know what the national environment is going to be in November. Anyone who says that they have that, I would not put a lot of trust in what they say. The list that we have here is reflective of it could be a red wave and it could be a blue wave and it could be neither. For example, Delaware, not a very competitive state unless it happens to be an overwhelmingly Republican electorate by the time we get to November. On the flip side, Georgia, probably not going to flip except in a case where there's an extremely strong Democratic environment come November. The states that are the most competitive here are the Wisconsin House and Senate. That's because of redistricting that just took place. The governor just signed new maps in Wisconsin. Alaska has a coalition in both chambers. The Senate one is much more of a coalition. It's a couple people who have joined the Republican caucus in the House. But anytime you have coalitions, they can break down. So we consider both of those to be competitive. Pennsylvania Senate is likely to be competitive, as is the Pennsylvania House. And then the other ones that I would think of are Minnesota's House is likely to be quite close, as is Michigan's House and Senate, closely divided chambers. We will update this as we get a little bit closer to the election. So if you check back with NCSL, and my contact information is on the last slide, I can be happy to send you the latest version of this. Next slide. So federal races, we're just going to breeze through this. Next slide. This is the 2024 Senate map. If you see the texture, that means it's an incumbent who is not running for re-election, but their party is reflected. Next slide. So these are the Cook Political Report ratings on the Senate. Only 10 of the 34 races they consider to be competitive, but you have Florida and Texas in the favored Republican category, Maryland, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin in the Democratic category. And we have a few toss-ups here. So Arizona, Montana, and Ohio. These are seats controlled by an independent who caucuses with the Democrats and then 2 Democrats. So all of the competitive races are on the Democratic side. And if you remember, Democrats only have a 1-seat majority in the Senate, assuming that they 2 seats if you count the fact that Kamala Harris can break ties as vice president. Next slide. House is very close. I would expect this to be a very competitive chamber this fall, 219 to 213 after the special election of Tom Suozzi to replace George Santos. Next slide. And this is just something that you can have for your records later, but if you're interested in keeping up with the work that I or my colleagues do at NCSL, these are all of the ways that you can connect with our resources. Next slide. And that's my contact information. I'll be on at the end to answer any questions, but feel free to reach out anytime. And thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Ben. So you can see there's a ton of races coming, and he just covered state and federal. There's, everything from council members and mayors and school board members at the local level as well. So please get involved and know who's on your ballot, which we will cover later. Next up, we have nonprofit nonpartisanship as a core value. This is one of our key issues at the National Council of Nonprofits. And to cover it today, we have Tim Delaney, the president and CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits. He is sometimes called the godfather of nonprofits and has previously worked in private practice as a state solicitor general and founded a nonprofit promoting ethical leadership across the country. He's argued in the U.S. Supreme Court, testified before Congress, and negotiated in the White House. He's an expert on all the rules of advocacy and lobbying, and nonprofit nonpartisanship is one of his favorite topics, which I can say with complete confidence. Tim, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Tiffany. I'm delighted to be with everybody today. I'm glad you could join us. I've been tasked with talking about nonprofit nonpartisanship as a core value. And what I intend to do is to break down the laws about what 501c3 organizations, charitable nonprofits, foundations, and religious congregations. And I will be referring to all 3 of those types of 501c3s collectively as nonprofits. And I'll be talking about what you can do and what you cannot do in connection with government elections. Next slide. Just want to remind everybody that there are certain things in life, such as a gas fire, that can be dangerous. They can burn people and burn things, and it can cause explosions, yet it's a very useful tool for heating and cooking. The key is we need to learn how to use it correctly. Next slide. Electricity is also dangerous. People get electrocuted and even die, yet it can also be a very useful tool. It can help you heat, cook, charge your smartphones, and even power your computer and your Zoom that you're tuning in on. And then driving a car is dangerous. You can have a wreck, you can hurt yourself and others, and even cause death. Yet hundreds of millions of people drive daily because it can be a useful tool to accomplish so much. Yet we need to learn how to use a car correctly. And so it is with nonprofits and elections. Yes, just like other tools, it can be dangerous, although here no one will die. But if you do violate these federal tax laws, you might have to pay an excise tax as a penalty. And if your actions are egregious, knowing and intentional violations, then your organization could even lose your tax exempt status. Next slide. And the point of this is to make sure that you know the rules. Helping nonprofits legally engage in elections can have a huge benefit for your organizations, the people you serve, and indeed our entire country. As Ben pointed out, there's a lot at stake on the ballot this fall. So let's dive in and find out what the rules are. On this slide, we're talking about the rules and the need to be safe. Jess, if we can go back one, if you know the basic rules, you'll be safe. Good lawyers tend to sweat the details. We're thinking about all the contingencies that can go wrong, the things that can blow up in a client's face. And so we focus on all the mini rules, the sub rules, and the fact that the IRS could go nuclear and take away a nonprofit's 501c3 status is something that then gets our attention as attorneys. And so we're always out there saying, ooh, stay away. But if we stayed away when it comes to things like driving, where we haven't read every footnote in the official driver's handbook or all the criminal and traffic and transportation laws in a given state, and sweat every detail in the owner's manual of a book, we would never get behind the wheel. And so lawyers can hyperventilate, yet what we need to do is remember, as nonprofits, there are some basic rules. When you're driving, you don't run into people or things or other cars, and you don't drink and drive. And so it is with nonprofits and political campaigns. You need to stay strictly nonpartisan and don't do anything that would help or hurt a candidate for public office. Those are the basic rules. And we need to be coloring inside the lines and following the rules, but we don't have to freak out about it. So next slide. Again, section 501c3 of the tax code, we're all registered as 501c3s, or you probably wouldn't be on this call. And it lays out that we all have to be organized and operated. That's a requirement. And then there are certain things that we cannot do. It's forbidden that we cannot, for example, next slide, engage in activities that our attorneys and judges would shake their fingers at us and say, no, don't go there, stay away. Yet, if we look at the rules, next slide, we will see that there are some legalities. For all of the forbidden things, there are some things we can do. We cannot inure to the benefit of any of our funds for any private individual, and yet we can pay legal reasonable compensation. While we can't engage in influencing legislation, it is legal for us to do less than a substantial amount to influence non-legislative public policy and to take 501 election to lobby. And so some things are allowed. And next slide, the same is true with nonprofits engaging in elections to a certain extent, and it requires that we remain nonpartisan so that we cannot be campaigning for or against candidates for public office. And if there are not any candidates involved, such as a ballot measure, we can get engaged. Next slide. So all this goes back, that last part is known as the Johnson Amendment. It was added in 1954, and it provides that we may not participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. It's known as the Johnson Amendment because Senator Johnson, who was the minority leader, he was not in charge of the Senate, he was not president, he was the minority leader in the Senate, and he proposed it. Nobody opposed it, and it became law in 1954. I raise this because a lot of people are trying to make him out as the boogeyman who did all these things. And yet there was no controversy at the time. He had faced some opposition in his state by some people that were organized as nonprofits. And so he didn't like that. At the same time, that was the MacArthur era, and there was legislation introduced in the House that the House then closed down, and then he picked it up and introduced it in the Senate. And so it was not controversial. In fact, President Eisenhower, who was a Republican, signed it into law in 1954. No controversy. President Reagan, a Republican, signed an amendment to it in 1987. No controversy. And it's only been in the last few years that some people are saying, ooh, this is bad. It's not bad, folks. It is good. It provides a lot of very good things for nonprofits. Next slide. It says that we may not participate in. Let's first talk about why it's good, and that includes that we may not use any of our resources to participate or intervene in elections for against candidates for public office. We can't use our money or other resources, such as our office space. We cannot use our offices for a political party or a candidate to come in and use our phones as a phone bank center. We cannot go out and endorse and put a thumbs up for candidates and say, we as a nonprofit want to support this candidate. Nor can we do like the Roman emperors and do thumbs down and say, we oppose this candidate. We can't take any positions on candidates. And you can invite a candidate, you can invite someone who happens to be a candidate to one of your meetings or an event, as long as you're inviting them not as a candidate, but for another reason. For example, if someone is the governor and you invite them to talk about some issues that are going on in your state, that doesn't mean that you're endorsing the governor. But if the governor happens to be a candidate, you need to remind the governor and probably do it in writing, so there's a paper trail to say, Governor, you're invited as the governor of our state and not as a political candidate. The law says that you cannot use this as a campaign event. You are not authorized to hand out any of your literature at this event. Don't talk about campaign. Talk about the things that have to do with what you're doing in office as the current office holder. Next slide. Also, we as nonprofits cannot be engaged in any publishing or distributing of statements on behalf of or opposition to any candidate for public office. We may not put something in our newsletter about a candidate. We cannot, there's IRS provisions pointing out that I could not, for example, write something saying, oh, I really believe in this candidate, and then pay my organization for the space that I took up in the newsletter. That's not allowed. And we can't put anything on our websites for or against candidates. We cannot go out and be pushing through emails statements for or against candidates. And our staff should never be using our resources for that purpose. We should not be wearing the literature or the T-shirts with the names of the candidates in the office. We should not be passing out their pamphlets. It's not allowed. That's not what nonprofit resources are there for. Next slide. And we cannot get involved in anything that has to do with a political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. And so if it's a candidate and you have people who are standing for office, we may not get involved. We must remain nonpartisan, stay out of it. And we can either give thumbs up nor thumbs down. We've got to stay away. Next slide. You've now heard all these things that we can't do. We can't do. Well, for those of us who have been so deeply involved in charitable nonprofit work for so long, we embrace the fact that we cannot do those things because nonpartisanship is a core value of nonprofits. It protects us, protects our money for the mission. For example, can you imagine having candidates come in and say, you know, I'm a candidate for the mayor or for the governor or for president or Congress, and I would like for your nonprofit to donate some of your money. And because the law says we can't, we can hold up the law as a shield and say, so sorry, we can't do that as a matter of law. If that law didn't exist, you know that they would be coming in there and banging on you, asking for money. And as soon as there are suggestions that nonprofits are using their money to help candidates, then all of a sudden you're going to lose public trust and future contributions. So that's why we embrace this. It also protects our focus on our mission. Can you imagine your board members showing up and then arguing on who they should be endorsing or how much money they should be given to which candidates, from a dog catcher all the way up to the presidency? And by the law protecting us from partisanship, we can say none of this garbage in our boardrooms or our staff meetings. We are not engaged in partisanship. Next slide. And the law also protects us for the public trust and donors' trust. If you've ever noticed when reporters get loose in their language in a story and say that a nonprofit like a 501c4 or a 501c6, which are able to get involved in political campaigns, that and the reporter just says this nonprofit was giving money, all of a sudden those of us who are 501c3s stop getting donations. And if you look at the comments to those articles, a lot of people write in saying, oh, I will never give a penny to another nonprofit. I can't believe they're doing that, which just goes to show we've got to protect the public trust so that people continue to support nonprofits. Next slide. And it protects democracy. It prevents another avenue to dark money. As you know, 501c3s, we don't report to the world just on a confidential basis to the IRS who's donating to us. If people were able to contribute to nonprofits through charitable nonprofits, 501c3s, no one would ever know that they're making political campaigns. Next, then that would also allow the wealthy to go in and plunk down $10,000, $100,000, $100 million to a candidate through your nonprofit. They would get a tax deduction for that. And because the smaller contributors normally just take the standard deduction, regular people would not have that advantage. And so it would be a loophole just for you and me to be paying for the political donations of the wealthy. That would be wrong. And many of us go to our religious congregations and our houses of worship in order to avoid the toxic partisanship. We get engaged, a lot of us in nonprofits, because we're community problem solvers. We're not partisan advocates just beating up on each other. We don't go in to have our preacher or our rabbi telling us who to vote for. That would be wrong. And that's why so many religious congregations stand firmly in support of the Johnson Amendment and say, thou shalt not go into our facilities and pollute it with all the toxic partisanship. Next slide. As you can tell, I get fired up about this. What the IRS has told us and tells us in writing is that we are permitted to engage in candidate campaigns as long as we do so on a nonpartisan basis. For example, we can promote people registering to vote. We can put out signs in our lobbies. We can put up sign-up tables. We can do that at our offices and at events. It's fun. We can be educating voters about the voting process, like what's going to be on the ballot, what ballot measures, what candidates, when and where, etc. We could be distributing nonpartisan voter guides. Do it from a trusted source, though, like a state or local government. If you pick up a candidate stuff or something from a political party and start handing that out as voter guides, that is no longer nonpartisan. You can't do that. And we can engage on a nonpartisan basis to conduct get out the vote drives to encourage people to vote. We can also host candidate forums. We can also create candidate questionnaires. That's where, as an attorney, I start hyperventilating and want to protect my clients and make sure that we are doing things strictly by the book, and things get a little more nuanced in those two areas. You can do them, and I would encourage you to do them. But if you do, only do it with the advice of an attorney so that you don't inadvertently cross a line. But all the others are really straightforward and easy. Next slide. And it's also permissible for us to engage in ballot measures, such as propositions and initiatives and referenda and bond elections. The law says that equates to lobbying because the voters are the lawmakers, not elected officials. And so in that instance, we are in essence lobbying the public to vote for or against a ballot measure. And so that doesn't count as is inappropriate lobbying, and so that's fine. Next slide. And so the bottom line is, like everything else in life, we just have to know the rules. Final slide. And if you know the basic rules, stay nonpartisan, don't support or oppose a particular candidate, then it's real easy, color inside the lines, and everybody will be safe. So please engage, and you can be a unicorn as a nonprofit that's engaging and doing the right thing. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. So I think you clarified the line between what's legal and what's not legal and why we all live under the Johnson Amendment. Next up, we want to turn to what nonprofits and why nonprofits specifically should be involved in the elections this year. So with that, we are turning to Liz Moore, who is the Executive Director of Montana Nonprofit Association and the Chair of the Board of the National Council of Nonprofits. As the Executive Director, she serves more than 650 nonprofits from every part of Montana and provides education, resources, cost-saving products, public policy and advocacy, information, and a sense of cohesion and connection to Montana's nonprofits. She has been deeply involved in protecting the Johnson Amendment in the state and across the country, and is dedicated to nonprofit advocacy and engagement during the 2024 elections. Thank you, Liz. Over to you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Next slide. So I'm going to spend a minute talking about trust. That really is the focus of my 20 minutes. So we want to engage a cynical, standoffish constituency, or really involved, passionate constituency. Either way, we need to do this in a way that promotes trust. So we'll start with why nonprofits are involved in elections anyway, and then what is the state of public trust, and how does that bear on our ability to impact trust? I'm not going to spend hardly any time on the rules of election activity. You're kind of gotten that from Tim, and you'll get it afterwards as well, after I speak. And so let's go ahead and talk about why nonprofits are involved in elections. Next slide. This is part of our DNA. So when we think about nonprofits, we are at the nexus of community needs, public policy issues, election issues, and then we have the nonprofit the nonprofit mission. So there's this historical intersection between community needs and all of the rest of this. When we look back to the earliest nonprofit formed in the United States in 1775, it was the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and for Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. That's a long name, now called the Pennsylvania Society for Abolition Society. So this was a response to the predominant societal issue of the day. So the nonprofit was formed to deal with this issue, and the policy issues at the time really related to the legality of ownership of people. And so then as pressure was born into abolition and slavery through the work of nonprofits and others, there became some of the states began to make slavery illegal, sometimes for personal reasons that benefited them, but nonetheless making slavery illegal. So at that time, the Society for Abolition really became involved in litigation and policy efforts. And then during this same time, 1775 to 1860, we saw that slavery was the overriding issue in elections. And it was until really when Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860. So the statute changed then in 1865. And so this nonprofit effort preceded all that. It took 90 years for this change to happen. And then, of course, there's still this very nonprofit still exists today with to provide grants that combat racism. So we look at the current day, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had nonprofit activism all over it. So this is just one example of how nonprofits have in our DNA voting. Go ahead. So we think about trust, and there's a lot of data on trust right now. And so I'm going to talk briefly about trust in government, trust in elections, and trust in each other. So according to Pew Charitable Trusts, trust in government is pretty much at a low. So during the Johnson administration that Tim was just talking about, the trust percentage, however they measured it, was at 80. Today, it's lower than 20%. So, and this is over this 1958 to 2023 hill. So it slides down the hill like a toboggan without anyone steering. And then we have, and this is like questions like, do politicians care about the people? Will politicians get the work done? You know, those kinds of things. Am I being told the truth by politicians? Then trust in elections. There's a worldwide decrease in trust in elections. And folks just trust the accuracy, the legality, the security, all of that. And what's interesting, I think, is that while the decrease or the decline in trust in elections is rather slow, there's a huge gap whether you are a Republican or a Democrat. There are gaps related to gender. So if you're a Republican, you trust elections less than if you're a Democrat. If you're a man, you trust elections more than if you are a woman. If you have wealth and education, you trust elections more than if you are in poverty. So there are these gaps that are more demographic gaps than an overall score on trust. Then there's data on interpersonal trust, and this is really interesting. In 1985 or so, about 50% of Americans agreed that most people could be trusted. Today, that number is about 32%. So then we get to nonprofit trust. Next slide. So we trust nonprofits. You can see that there's, and the data, for years has shown that nonprofits are trusted more than big business, small business, government, all those kinds of things, other kinds of institutions. In 2023, an interesting thing happened. There was a 4% drop in trust in nonprofits. And some of that may be related to some of the things we heard about with engagement in partisan politics, the rise of dark money, all those kinds of things. It may be a campaign, who knows? But one thing we know is that trust is like a fabric. And so if we think about trust being this piece of fabric under our community and under our society and our ways we interact, as the fabric frays in any one area, it's weaker in all areas. And this is why trust becomes an important part of our efforts toward a strong democracy. And it's not just about being the most trusted resource. It's about this being an asset and a commodity that strengthens us as a people. And so we all have this responsibility to contribute to trust. And there are all kinds of ways we can do that. And so there's data that shows that to the degree we're a less trusting community, we are less civically engaged. We also see more in terms of mental health issues and suicide and crime and these kinds of things as mistrust grows. So just like during COVID, we learned that breathing was communal, and we had to all take responsibility for going out and how we breathed into the air. We need to do the same with trust. Next slide. Okay, despite that there's some agreement that we don't want nonprofits doing nonpartisan work or partisan work, there's large agreement that from the public that get out the vote kinds of behaviors are expected and acceptable. So go ahead, next slide. The kinds of activities folks support. First of all, meetings with meeting people and talking with them about how to vote, or providing information about how to vote. 80% of folks favor that. Meeting with government officials about the work the organization is doing. The public understands this and supports it as part of the nonprofit mission. Encouraging people to write, call, encouraging engagement. Folks expect that and encourage it from nonprofits. Op-eds, we expect that. Participating in get out the vote activities. That score is lower. It's about 59%. That's still a majority who find this an appropriate behavior by nonprofits. Next. So Tim really covered what we can and can't do. So what I'll say is that this is in the IRS code and it's very clear. All you have to do is Google it. The best place I have found to cover really what folks can and can't do is, and this is for you nonprofit geeks, okay? So I'm speaking to the right group. The Form 990, Part C, instructions. It has all the definitions for lobbying, advocacy, electioneering, all of that. And so if you want to really understand clearly the bright lines the IRS holds around this, I recommend that as reading. And it's actually not bad reading. Okay, next. Well, let's go through these slides. We'll just run through these. Tim already did this, and so I won't cover this. Let's go ahead to the next slide, 13, I think it is. Keep going. Okay, so what's next? If we do the math, I hope I've made the case that there is a trust deficit. There's a hole in the bucket and it's not getting stopped anytime soon, and it certainly doesn't get stopped up during elections. Can we change that? Not all of it, no. But can we contribute in putting trust back into the bucket in some ways, or finding a different container? Yes, we can. So some ways, and this gets to not the rules, but the ways we interact. So organizations can listen to and hear and understand the other. And this is a bigger group than we might be imagining. Okay, so our circle is actually pretty large, and values are all over the place in the circles we're part of and in the networks we're part of. Sometimes we don't want to say what our values are or what we're thinking for fear that it doesn't match the status quo within our organization. One way that organizations can practice this is bring an article to a staff meeting that generally folks are going to have different opinions on, or that everybody really dislikes, and ask in the staff meeting, what were they thinking? What, assuming best intention, assuming these are folks that are rational, and sometimes that's hard, but assume that. Debate. What are they thinking about as they present this perspective? What are folks that rail out against use of gender pronouns? What are they thinking? Folks that are against gun control, for gun control, what are they thinking? We can practice that. Then prioritizing an organizational culture that focuses more on authenticity than agenda. This is not as easy as it sounds. We all think we do this, but when we do needs assessments, we need that information. I think about the Head Start program, and when we engage parents, we're mandated to engage parents. They're not mandated to engage with us. A lot of our big funding relies on this idea that we need to deliver some things and people aren't forced to take them. And so finding, that kind of agenda we always carry is perhaps more present than we would like to think. So, putting a pause on agenda and thinking about how do we engage authentically, even though we have an agenda. It takes a little bit more time. Put a commitment to news accuracy into your comms plan. So, and you can do this as a commitment and also demonstrate to people how to use it. So if you post a news article, find your website or your app or whatever that rates news bias, post a little line under your article that says what the bias is and or that what this news source is. That begins to teach people to look for that so that we're beginning to look for accurate news instead of just emotional news. You can use fact checkers like Snopes, Open Secrets. I looked at PolitiFact. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning fact checker, and it had an Instagram misfact on the front page. So, we may need to begin using things like that a little bit more in order to argue against using social for, I'm looking at my time, against using social for our news source. Young people use it. So if you are working with young people, begin to put some of these things on your social media. I saw one that said, Trump's hair wig falls off during rally speech. That was a pants on fire falsehood. There was another one that said, Google proves no one ever went to the moon. February 16th, that was a falsehood, I guess. So, and then teach what social media is best and not best for. And ways to do that are very personal. So there's so many ways we have innuendo around social media, and it can even be posting or reposting and saying right with a lot of question marks. If something may spew some amount of unkindness into the world, even if it's right, do we need to say it? Do we need to do that? One thing we can do is read our own posts and see how they come across in tone. Next, creating an organizational culture where diversity of thought is safe. I think this is harder, again, than we think. It's especially when we have really a progressive agenda, and there may be progressive thought expressed all the time, and it becomes difficult, challenging for people who don't share that thinking to say it out loud. So it's like erring on the other side of diversity. How do we create exercises that allow people to say, well, and again, it's that, what might they have been thinking? Why might this be the perspective of a legislator? What do we know about this legislator that allowed them to vote this way or pushed them to vote this way? So we really begin to think about and practice diverse storytelling, diversity of thought verbally. That's saying that's a perspective I hadn't heard of. Being a watchdog and an advocate for representative participation, I think the best way to do this is to pay attention to election integrity bills. There's so much out there around protecting integrity, and it ends up being voter suppression. And so just be really aware of any statute, who is it benefiting and who's potentially harmed by it. And as we monitor representative participation in democracy. Then bringing people together, nonprofits do this. We know that when people come together, empathy grows. We don't need to have a rally. We can bring people together for whatever. And whether it's line dancing or crochet or a silent book club, when we bring people together and they are connected to one another, community all by itself can breed more trust. And then actively practice examining issues. Factually, we've kind of covered that. We don't have to land on one right answer. Sometimes it's good to ask if it's more important to be right or more important to be civil. Then, and there are times when it is more important to be right, but most times aren't that. Most times, most times we don't have to argue that. We want to work for the right, but we don't have to argue for the right every single chance we get. We can practice gracious space, teaching tolerance, these kinds of things. And then just noticing within ourselves and within our circles and our partners and our coalitions, to what degree do we invite in those who are the surprise guests who might have a different perspective? Do we have a board that's diverse in thinking? Do we have a policy committee that's diverse in thinking? A Pew Research article recently showed that we, as a country, as Americans, we actually have more in common than we feel we have in common. So we feel that, and there was one poll I saw that was about elections or about the legislature. Oh, it was our own poll. On a survey we did this summer, we saw that nonprofits felt that generally other nonprofits fared worse than they did in the legislative session. And then we saw that they felt that the nonprofit sector as a whole fared worse than other nonprofits and worse than they did. And so there's this perception of worse that is arm's length. And this Pew Research bore that out, that we actually have more in common than we might feel like we do. And so all of these tactics allow us ways to pursue and explore what is it we actually do have in common. And in that way, we build trust and we engage folks appropriately in the institutions of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. That was wonderful to show how we can build and maintain our communities, both within our organization and within the societies that we live in. So thank you very much. Next, we'd like to turn over to how and what nonprofits can actually do during this period. And with that, we have Gwen Stembridge. She is the Training and Partnerships Coordinator at Nonprofit Vote. She has experience as a community organizer, policy analyst, volunteer program manager, and nonprofit professional. She leads Nonprofit Vote's webinars and trainings for nonprofits across the country to ensure that they have the tools and resources they need to participate in voting. Gwen, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Tiffany and NCN. Let's get into it. Nonprofit Vote, for those of you who are not familiar, is a national organization. We are working to equip nonprofits, you all, with nonpartisan, in particular nonpartisan tools and resources, so that the communities that you serve have access to voting. One of the things I want to point out in our vision is this phrase, inclusive democracy, and you'll hear this throughout our work. But when we say that, we're talking about who participates in the voting process, not what party they vote for or who they vote for, but we're looking to close some of these gaps in voter participation. For instance, gaps for low-income voters, for young people, for folks of color, who are underrepresented in the voting process. Next slide. So there are these gaps, as I talked about, in voter participation. These gaps exist along lines of race, income, and age, are the ones that I'll focus on today. There are others with other aspects of identity. So a lot of these gaps are caused by these voter contact practices. I'm sure many of you are on more than one list for a partisan or nonpartisan organization that reminds you to vote, right? Anybody looking forward to all of those text messages and emails in this 2024 presidential election year? And while those may be a lot for some of us that are very plugged in, there are people in our neighborhoods or who are receiving services or participating in programs run by our nonprofits who are receiving none of that information about voting. Campaigns look at likely voters, at folks who have voted before, and those are the folks that they contact. They're not looking to register new people. It's just too much effort for a lot of these partisan campaigns. So this is where nonprofits come in and can help to close that gap. The cycle is going to continue to perpetuate an inequitable democracy and keep those key voices from being heard by elected officials unless we take the step to register those voters, to work to get the information, accurate, nonpartisan information to those voters. Next slide, please. So nonprofits, particularly those who are serving low income and otherwise marginalized communities, are the key part, the key kind of linchpin to changing this system. I love, Liz, how much you talked about trust. And this is where nonprofits come in. Volunteers, voters have often trusted nonprofit staff for things like benefits, navigating the benefit system or free tax prep. And the voting process similarly should be accessible. And it's really key to have those trusted voices to help folks navigate these systems that are not always set up for them. Next slide, please. So our work at Nonprofit Vote, where we come in, is through a lot of tools that we're providing to you all as nonprofits to ensure you can do this work. So I'll be able to share some of these links, and you'll receive these in the PowerPoint afterward. But we have a whole toolkit on our website that has webinars, that also has all kinds of resources. It's a big resource library that has worksheets, timelines, all kinds of other voter engagement tools. For those of you who might be funders, I encourage you to check out the Philanthropy for Voter Engagement initiative, which encourages funders to fund nonprofits to do this voter engagement work. And then also I wanted to just flag that we are the managing organization of National Voter Registration Day, which is September 17th this year. Please mark your calendars, and you can also register to be a community partner at nationalvoterregistrationday.org. Next slide, please. Yeah, great, thank you. So there are a lot of things, we heard a lot about what your organizations cannot do, but there are a lot of things that you can do to encourage your community to show up and vote. There are some really simple kind of low entry point options. It could be as simple as amplifying information from your local Board of Elections. You can start by reaching out to your local Board of Elections to say, how do we get the most accurate information? Are there lists we need to be on? Believe it or not, a lot of boards of elections have social media. You can follow them. You can just get to know, what are those important dates? What are the deadlines for things like mail-in ballots, for registration, all of those things. Just get that information. You can just start by amplifying that information. So it could be that you have a little corner of your newsletter, and you give a little blurb about it there. You can put information about voter registration in your lobby, on your website, on your social media. These can be kind of some low lift items that you can do, especially if you're just starting out and feeling maybe a little overwhelmed already with your regular work. These are some low lift items you can do, fairly easily. If you're in a state that has online voter registration, you can put that link to register in your email signature. If you don't have online voter registration in your state, you can link to the County Board of Elections or the Secretary of State website, depending on what population your organization serves. But think about the ways that your nonprofit engages with the community, and then think about how you could incorporate voter engagement into that process. Next slide, please. As a step up, you could train your staff who are already working with program participants to register individuals to vote. If you're a food bank or a food service program and you have staff or volunteers who are already helping participants register for benefits, maybe you could include ensuring that they have updated their voter registration. The laws are different in every state, but in every state there is something that you can do. Also, consider partnering with other organizations that are maybe working with similar populations or also doing work in your region. You don't have to do this work alone. And as nonprofits, we know the value of collaboration over competition. And it's so important to also keep that in mind here, right? We're not trying to add work to anyone's already full plates. We want to make this as accessible as possible. Another step up could be engaging candidates in a candidate questionnaire or a candidate forum. We have tools that can help you do this on our website in our resource library. We also know, though, that these are politically charged times. So if you feel more comfortable consulting an attorney, we really encourage you to do so. There may be somebody on your board or a connection through the community that you can get that information from. Also, feel free to get creative about the way that you get the word out. Think about what speaks to your particular community. Maybe there's a caravan through the neighborhood blasting music and passing out voter registration information. We saw a lot of that happen during 2020. One of the silver linings, if there was any, was the creativity that came out of ways that people registered voters, ways that we adapted. And I think that really is something to celebrate. Can you, if you're working with youth, can you engage those young people to encourage the adults in their life to vote? By, I've seen adorable letters about how voting impacts their lives, right? Folks who are making decisions on policies that impact youth, but those youth don't get a chance to vote for those elected officials. So a letter to an adult in their life encouraging them to vote could make a really big difference. I'm picturing macaroni, all the fun kid cards you get. Also, do you have a set of volunteers that you haven't really been able to engage yet in some way? They want to engage in some way. Train them up to register voters. And this can be a really, again, an easy thing that they can learn to do. Learn about the laws in your state, about voter registration drives, and then engage those volunteers to register people to vote. Next slide, please. I can't emphasize enough that activities must not be partisan in any way. I think we've said that several times. I hope you walk away knowing that. Liz, when you talked about trust, I was thinking about one of the things I remind myself in this area as we're in this politically charged time. We are a nonprofit ecosystem, and voting is a really important part of that system, but it's not going to be the sole thing that saves us. It's definitely important to vote, but there are so many other ways that at the same time we're lifting up our communities. So it's really not worth risking your 501c3 status just to get someone in office that has maybe made some promises to you. That's kind of my real life take on it, because it's really whatever you are doing with your 501c3 status is so crucial and so important. And so just please don't risk that and risk the services that you are bringing to your community that are so important. Please don't risk those. There are other ways to engage. Next slide, please. Wanted to talk a little bit about staff members too, because it's important to recognize that our staff members are often trusted because of their community position. So any participation in partisan activities really should be reserved for times that are clearly off the clock. No organizational resources can go toward political campaigns. And so if you're a leader at your organization that does want to do voter registration, we would encourage you to give staff time off to vote. You can join, there's a nonprofit staff vote initiative that I can put the link to as well, that has policies, sample policies, and just some guidance around that. Next slide, please. The next piece here, I just wanted to make sure that I really highlight this tool. So you can take a picture with this QR code that is here, or you can click on the link when you get these slides afterward. But this is our checklist of nonpartisan election activities. So you can go to this tool, you can download it, you can print it, it's a PDF. You can go through and choose the types of activities that might be a good fit for your organization. These are just ideas. And of course, you can have these different entry points if you need to do something more simple, or if you're ready to take it to the next step, you can do that as well. But this is one of those really key tools I just want to highlight. Next slide, please. wanted to just highlight a few of these links here and make sure that they're all in one place for you. We have a webinar that is coming up on March 6th, and I can put the link there, but that is about staying nonpartisan generally. We'll go into detail. It's a partnership with Alliance for Justice with one of their attorneys. So you'll be able to answer, ask and have answered some more specific questions there. So I just want to highlight that as the next webinar. And then there are some links additionally there. Next slide, please. And then these are some other tools in particular that are on our website that I just wanted to highlight. If you are deciding to do a candidate forum or something like that, there's this guide for working with candidates, answering questions like, what do you do if a candidate wants to come to your fundraiser and asks to speak? How do you respond to that? And kind of navigates you through some of those things. And then our most recent webinar in 2024 was in January, and was about getting a head start on your voter outreach, and is a tool that you can kind of fill in yourself. It's a Google Doc. You can fill in and really get some more information, really dig deep into what is your capacity, what do you have the ability to do, what's kind of practical for your organization. So all of those tools are linked there. Next slide, please. That's it from me. I wanted to give a shout out to National Voter Registration Day. And if you want to register voters in your very stylish t-shirt, you can also do that. You can be a vote regisaurus. But happy voting. And I will also didn't share my contact information, but I'm happy to also be a resource if it is helpful. Thanks so much, Tiffany. On to you.
Thank you, Gwen. I think that covered most of the questions we had prior. We got some from the registration, and a lot of those were these specific, what can you do with candidate forums and registration and things like that. So those resources are key, and we'll be sending those out. But let's turn to some question and answer. We had, as I mentioned, almost 100 questions before we even started this webinar, and we've gotten a dozen more since then. But maybe we can cover some kind of rapid fire questions I think would be helpful. And I don't know if the rest of the presenters want to join us on screen here. We can do some quick questions. Maybe I'll break them down to some topics. So I think that one of the questions that I saw in the Q&A box that kept coming up is this idea between candidates and then actually advocating or lobbying for specific issues. So could we explain briefly, maybe Tim or Liz or Gwen, if you want to jump in on kind of the difference between issue advocacy, legislation, and lobbying, and what is permitted by nonprofits, specifically 501c3s. Tim, do you want to take that real fast?
Sure. Issue advocacy is a good thing. It's a healthy thing. Who are we as nonprofits, as those who are closest to the problems, which means that we're closest to the solutions? Why should we be hoarding that just to ourselves? We should be sharing that information with policymakers so they can make better decisions. And we can always engage in issue advocacy in terms of talking to legislators, city council people, governors, whatever. The issue is if we were to do that in a way that is suggesting to others that we're supporting them as candidates or opposing them as candidates. And so we want to stay away from anything having to do with the elections. But in terms of advocating for or against policies, that's fair. Now, some political parties at different times like to quote unquote own certain issues, and they claim them as their own. Just because they go about trying to own something and force their positions, and again, this is coming from the left and the right. Everybody's guilty of that in terms of partisan political people. But we don't have to play by those rules in the sense of saying that we can't talk about certain things. Now, when it gets closer to an election, you need to recognize that some people will target you and say that you are crossing the line. So you've got to be respectful in terms of some of the timing, but just because someone is for or against guns or abortion or education or whatever it might be, doesn't mean that we have to stay away from those issues entirely. But if a candidate is associated with just one issue and it gets real close to the election, it's probably not the time to go out and be talking about their opponent, one or them, in one way or another. And
Liz, I
and overall, just know that the IRS applies a facts and circumstances test, which is lawyer-esque for, oh, it depends on which way the wind's blowing at a given time. So you have to be careful and be respectful and be reasonable. Liz?
It's really easy to mix up in one bowl campaign issues and lobbying and advocacy issues. But really, we have two separate processes. So what we've been talking about today is campaigns and nonpartisan activity. Lobbying is not partisan. Now, if it's connected to a campaign, then you have to think about that. But lobbying is acceptable. I saw a question about to what degree, generally thought to be like 5%-ish of your budget, but far smarter to do what's called a 501H election. And that's a half a sheet form that you can fill out and you get this election, and the IRS provides you a math formula for how much you can spend on direct lobbying and indirect lobbying, so grassroots lobbying. And so all of that is very mathematical, and it is not necessarily tied to elections. It's just that they are like magnetic poles or something. They just keep getting pulled together.
Thank you, Liz. And so for everyone to know, we do have the information and resources on our website, councilofnonprofits.org, about the 501H election if you're interested in it. When I've gotten a couple questions, both in the Q&A and prior, about specifically this idea if a candidate shows up to your event. And I think this happens all the time. Candidate asks to come or just appears and then wants to take a picture with you. What are the do's and don'ts in that kind of environment?
Yeah, great question. And I will preface this by saying I am not an attorney. So if the attorneys want to take a swipe at this too, you're welcome to. I think in those types of situations, I think it's really your job as a nonprofit staff member to really be clear about boundaries. And really, you can be really appreciative of candidates who are supportive of your work. But really, it's important to the future of the organization that there is not a boundary that is crossed there. So if they are attending one of your fundraisers and want to take a picture, I know I've been in situations like that before, and sometimes a picture is fine and it's harmless, and it's the elected official is saying, oh, I attended this event, and they're just taking pictures at the event. But if they are in any way associating you with the organization or tagging the organization in a social media post or something like that, I think it's really important just to be really upfront. It is better to be clear and better to err on the safe side than to risk the status of your nonprofit.
Yeah. We've had a lot of questions about ballot measures and ballot initiatives. Can someone please cover, is that the same as electioneering? And can nonprofits take positions on a ballot measure?
Absolutely, yes. Nonprofits can engage in ballot measures. Those do not relate to a candidate. They're not for or against a candidate, and it is nonpartisan. And yes, you can engage in electioneering having to do with ballot measures. Recognize that the IRS classifies that not as election related electioneering, but rather as legislative lobbying, because you're putting something to the vote of the people who are then acting directly as lawmakers, as opposed to having it go to a city council or Congress or the state legislature.
And just to tag on to what Tim is saying, one of the things that's important there is that you will still be required to do the reporting around that, just as if you were lobbying in front of the legislature.
Thank you, Liz, for
And then
clarifying
that then gets into this distinction between direct lobbying and indirect lobbying and how to record all that. And again, all that is fine. It's legal. And it's just like cooking or cleaning or driving your car. Just follow the rules.
I think that's a good place to end. So the bottom line is, yes, you can advocate, yes, you can lobby, and yes, you should be engaged in the 2024 election, so long as you do so in a nonpartisan way. So with that, I want to thank all of our presenters for an excellent and informative presentation. Thank you to everyone who attended this and will be listening to this after the fact. The recording, the slides, and resources, everything that we just mentioned, and all of the presenters' contact information will be available probably tomorrow. So keep an eye on that. If you registered, you'll get an email. If not, it will be up on our website. And so with that, I want to say thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Go vote.